So I think we're live. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum everyone, and thank you for joining us here, and welcome to our first ever live stream. So I just want to introduce myself first. I'm Faisal. I'm the founder and CEO of No. And I want to welcome you all to what will be the first of what we hope will be monthly live streams, inshallah. So in these live streams, what you intend to discuss lots of really interesting, very different topics, often based on the theme of the content that we've been pushing out in that month. So I have with me here Sister Safiyyah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. And we have Brother Abu Bilaal Yakub.
Assalamu alaikum.
So inshallah, today we're going to be discussing a really, really interesting topic on the subject of how the Muslims united science and spirituality. And both, mashallah, both Safiyyah and Abu Bilaal are experts in this area. So we'll inshallah bring them in very, very soon. But I want to, before we start, I want to take some time, because it's the first live stream that we're having, to take some time to explain a little bit more about No, a little bit more about kind of the Second Golden Age campaign in general. And so I can provide some context. And then we'll get sort of deep into the discussion. So who are No and what do we do? So No, overall, we're a ed tech platform and we're aimed at disrupting the current way we learn and we take in knowledge. But in doing so, we want to revive the culture of lifelong learning for the global Muslim community. Now, why? What's the benefit of that? I mean, the problem that we solve is that we believe that modern education, and actually even Islamic education today, they're not creating thinkers. Or at least they're not creating thinkers who are formidable, who are like those that came before us. And what this is doing is that it's resulting in a bit of an impoverished state for the Ummah. And so, that's why we're subject to other people's narratives instead of, creating and following our own. So, if you look at the past, for example, Muslims were once the leaders in education. We were once the leaders in science, in learning. And that led on to great achievements and great discoveries. But, what happened? Once maybe we became complacent. But in any case, our impact on the world stopped, and so that's why we're now kind of easily led. We're kind of lagging behind, and so that's what it is. And look at the world we live in today. We're living in the information age, but ironically, the world's just filled with too much noise. We're surrounded by fake news and deception and lack of substance, and so it's quite difficult to navigate and figure out our purpose, so we can achieve our true potential. And so that's what we really want to do. Really, really want to take the subject of education and to revive what education is supposed to do, which is to change your character. It's supposed to benefit you and to to elevate you. And so how are we going to do that? So this is one of the questions that we asked ourselves internally was that what made those people of the past so different? We talk like in a way we kind of glorify the past, but is that a dead day? Is that day gone, or can we do something about it? And so that's why we said, is there a way that we can kind of reverse engineer what they did, and we combine it with the best of what the modern world have to teach us? And so with that kind of main question in mind, we created this multimedia series called The Second Golden Age. So what this consists of is a YouTube series, documentaries, articles, podcasts, courses, all sorts. And it's all dedicated and focused on learning what made those people of the past so great, reverse engineering that base foundation, and then combining it with the best of what the modern world teaches to revolutionize the way Muslims to revolutionize the way Muslims think, and more importantly, what impact they can make. So we've released an entire season on YouTube already, and we've just released episode 2 of season 2 on Friday. So the first episode of the second season covered nature, zoology, and the life sciences, and it told the story of Al-Jahiz, who discovered concepts such as microevolution, common ancestry, just by focusing and studying nature. So I think that's a pretty good introduction. And I actually let part of that part of today's discussion is actually driven by that. One of the main differences that we found that it was different then, compared to now, is that what we've done is that we've separated the curriculum. Science and all these other subjects are here, and Islam is here, and never the two shall meet. And what stood those pioneers of the past aside from people today, is that they were able to harmonize these two worlds, the scientific and the spiritual. So with that in mind, let's bring in Sister Sabreen and Brother Bilaal into the discussion. So just to give you a really quick introduction, Sister Safiyyah, she's a mechanical engineer and she's a scientist. She's pursuing a master's in philosophy and also studies Arabic grammar. And she's the content director at No, and has featured in a lot of the work that we do, mashallah. And Brother Bilaal, he's mashallah, very multi-talented. He's an author, he's a philosopher, he's a teacher, and he owns and runs a publishing company. And obviously he's a contributor at No, and he's got some very interesting courses coming out soon on philosophy and cosmology, inshallah. So I want to kick off the discussion with just a brief discussion of what's the issue? What's the issue with science today? How is it currently studied, and what's the problem with it? So Sabreen, can I just bring you in on that?
Yeah. So essentially, I mean, if you think about what the issue is and why this has to be discussed, why are we even talking about how Muslims united science and spirituality, is because, we live in a very different, a very, very weird paradigm now for Islam as Muslims today. And part of the issue is that we're told somehow for science to work and function correctly, it has to be divorced from any talk of God or religion. And that's the paradigm that we have to function in. That's how most of our education, our science, and most of our worldview functions with that. So firstly, you're given this segregation. For science to function correctly, you'll have to keep it separate from God. And then eventually this separation, at least that's what happened in Europe, is that after this segregation, then you have a complete abolishment and abandonment of religion, which is very problematic for us as a religious community. If you think about it, you're being told, firstly, an unwarranted claim, for science to function correctly. If you want to be scientific enough, if you want to be progressive enough, you have to segregate this. And then eventually it will, at some point in time, lead to an abolishment of religion. So if you think about it, what essentially is happening today is that because science is a progressive field, unlike religion, religion has completely different claims, but science is progressing every day. You have new technology. So you like it or you don't, this segregation, eventually, it's just a matter of time, will lead to an eventual abolishment of religion, which, like I said, is very problematic. Now, for us Muslims, I would say, it's a very different scenario. We had 800 years of science, like good science, and part of which actually inspired science in Europe. And in these 800 years or more, it was never divorced from God or from Islam. Actually, it was highly rooted in Islam and the Islamic worldview. So for us, this is a very weird, it's a very alien worldview to be in. So that's why I think it's very important for modern Muslims, for us all today, to tackle with this. How can you function in a paradigm that in a course of time, you will have to expect a sort of, either you abandon your religion or you'll have to abandon science. We don't want to do that either. So that's why it's important.
Okay, so let me just bring Abu Bilaal in here. So what I 100% understand what Sabreen's saying, but what's the problem with learning science from a Western perspective? So let's say I'll go to sort of university, we've got world-class scientists at Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard, or why don't I just learn it from them? And then I also study Islam on the side as well. And can't I just combine it that way?
Well, one of the most fundamental problems in philosophy is typically understanding or figuring out or authenticating what we would define as the truth. So the truth of whatever an individual might learn, might study, always needs some sort of authentication or validation or verification. And modern science tends to base its entire thesis on observation and experimentation.
Hmm.
But its background is fed by assumption. So science actually builds its foundation from an assumptive point of view. What if this is, or what if that is? Can we figure it out? So you start with a hypothetical reasoning, going into now developing a theory, and then a thesis, and then an antithesis or a synthesis. And then you actually come down and say, okay, now we have an established fact. But you only have an established fact doesn't necessarily make it a truth. How do you verify that that fact is in fact true?
Sure.
Modern philosophers will then argue and say, well, there is no such thing as an absolute truth. Truth is subjective, according to modern philosophy. And this subjectivity tends to create a vast diversity of ideology and thinking. So you have all these different kind of isms, and each of these isms and ists, atheism and nihilism and all the other isms, they tend to, each one tends to say, well, mine is the truth. What the Quran does is, and this is something that it did from the time of the Arabs itself, the Quran actually brought about concepts through its linguistic miracle, in which, even though the Arabic language was so mature at such a maturity, the Quran actually changed the meanings of certain concepts and words. The Quran, like all other scriptures in human history, always comes around to challenge and oppose what's human ideology. And it tells you that what you think you know isn't what it is. There's more to it, or it's something else entirely. That's where absolute truth comes in, because now the creator himself is telling you what he has created, how he has created it. So whether you're studying physicality in physics, or you're studying biology in terms of life itself, or you're studying chemistry in terms of the chemical world, the Quran and is the one that will come about and tell you the reality of what you're studying, because the creator himself is telling you what the truth of that thing is. So modern science has sort of limited itself into this factual reality and does not want to look at the absolute reality. And this is also going back to their definition of reality, because how you define, how you perceive reality depends on how you define reality. And that definition depends on your language of use. And how you will define reality and perceive reality will ultimately define how you cultivate your world. So if you allow me, I'll go into the actual definition of reality in this case.
Yeah, that'll be good. Yeah,
So if you look at the English language in linguistics used to be at one point in its early roots, in its early formation, so to speak, from Old English, it used to be an inflectious language. Inflection in a language is basically how that language is built up from root meanings. So if you look at the Arabic language is built from root meanings. That meaning goes right down into the specific letter and the sound that is pronounced. And this is testimony from the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses certain words and letters that every mufassir in the history of our tradition cannot understand the meaning of it. They would say, Allahu alam bima'naha, only Allah knows the meaning of this. So meaning actually comes from outside our world. It's not from within our world. It's not something that we cook up. The English language, unfortunately, over time started having culture define the language, whereas Islam used language to define the culture. So the definition of what's reality traces its roots back to the Latin word res. And res in Latin means matter, thing, goods, or property. And if you look at their definition, basically, thing is made of matter, and goods are manufactured things, and property is basically goods that you own. So right there in their language, you see embedded a sense of materialism. And it's language that defines the culture. And that then defines how they view, perceive, and cultivate the world. Whereas now, if you look at the Quranic definition of reality, reality does not mean thing in Arabic. Thing is shay'in, but reality is haqiqah, which derives its meaning from haq, which is one of the attributes of Allah as al-haq. So right there we can see that truth is not something that is of this world. It comes from outside the world, meaning the one who created the world defines what is the truth of the world. So our early scholars actually saw this harmonization between worldly sciences and what the study of the world and its physicality, its chemical composition, biology, and all those elements, and found that to verify what they had studied, they needed something else that came from outside the world to help explain it. Right. And this is one of the fundamental issues that science has, is that it tries to use science to verify itself, which is kind of a fallacy in logic, even in language. Because if you go back in a regression, right down to the first particle, the world as we know it is, well, the laws of science are what we call constants, right? Time, space, matter, cause and effect, gravity, velocity, motion, all these elements, these are constants of measurement. Sure. But if you go back to the first particle, you find that these constants didn't exist at that point. Because if you had time and space but no matter, what would you put there? Or if you had matter and time but no space, where would you put it? Right? Or if you had space and matter but no time, when would you put it? So these constants had to have come from outside. And cause and effect in this case is something that is built from within the closed system, from that point origin. Now, if you look at the Quran is not something that follows this linearity of cause and effect. It actually has a different system of explanation. A Quranic ayah is not bound by time, nor is it bound by space, and neither is it bound by matter, which means by logical deduction that the Quran is something that comes from outside the system, which then provides us with an authentic platform to verify what we've studied in the physical sciences.
Okay, very good. That's it's actually a very, very profound. Obviously, when you think about it in that with that perspective. I mean, just to bring Sabreen in for a second. So, I know that you've done a lot of studying of the greats of the past, and what does it look like? Because I think this is what people watching, and I understand that if you combine the two, maybe we can achieve something further. But I want to understand from yourself, like, what does it look like if you do combine if you do harmonize science and spirituality? What are the things that people have achieved in the past, and how did they kind of go on to do so, and how did this harmonization lead to achieving great things?
Faisal, the thing is, it's not just about the harmonizing. It's actually, it's a crisis of knowledge. It's not just, getting these together, then maybe it's, we're going to be led to something greater. But it's actually a crisis. Now, let me give you an example. Somebody like Isaac Newton was a very religious scientist. He was a devout Christian. But his, being devout didn't actually affect his his study of nature, his study of the laws of gravitation. Those weren't Christian laws as such. So he was actually working in a particular framework. Our problem is, the actual crisis of knowledge is that we are being told that science is the ultimate yardstick for everything, including God and religion. So it's not like a convenient option that we have. Okay, so let's combine science and spirituality, but we have no other option rather than we have to do this. We have to, go back to the past, understand how they did this. Otherwise, we are literally, we can say bye bye to our religion in another decade or two, or let's say half a century, because that's where it's leading to. If you have a dominant paradigm, that's telling you that everything needs to be judged by the standards, by the yardstick of science, including your religion, your revelation, that you hold in such high regard. That is problematic. And that, of course, has been discussed many a time, that in itself is a self-defeating claim. Because science itself cannot prove that it can be a yardstick for everything. So leave that alone. But the thing is, it's simple. Science and spirituality in the Islamic world, and we know it still, that science is a method. It's just a method. You can use it just like any other method. And what is spirituality? Spirituality is a view that there is more to reality than the physical world. So science being a method to study the physical world, spirituality being a view that there is more to stuff out there. And if let's say we can even have an experiment like this, get somebody who doesn't know Islamic history, just read the Quran. And that person will conclude that a culture that is based on the Quran will balance this really well between development of physical sciences, so physics, chemistry, biology, and all of that, and development of spiritual sciences. Why would it do that? Because in every page of the Quran, you have like a coupling of an exhortation, an invitation to study, reflect on the physical, and then conclude that there is more, there is something beyond this. So that is why Islamic scientific tradition, and many people are not aware of this, and this is something which has to be out there, is that the basic tenet of Islam, which is Tawheed, which we all believe in, La ilaha illallah, is the basic fundamental of the philosophy of Islamic science. It's the basis on which the philosophy of Islamic. Now, science cannot function without philosophy. You need a basic framework in place, framework of assumptions in place, and that constitutes its philosophy. So we can just go back and see in the works of Islamic scientists, they were functioning in a worldview, in a framework that was based on Tawheed. How are they doing that? If you were to ask me, how are they doing that? Was that for them, it was taken as it was given that the source of the physical world, the universe, the source of the human intellect, how we reason and stuff, and the source of the Holy Quran is one. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when you take that as a first principle, the sciences that you produce, the first sciences that were produced, we know this by history, were the religious sciences, so fiqh, tafsir, and usul literature. They actually were the first sciences that demonstrated the scientific spirit. They used inductive reasoning. Now, inductive reasoning is like central to how we conduct scientific research today. So because they had these things in mind, these assumptions, or you could say the philosophical framework that was gifted to them from the Quran in the form of Tawheed, using that framework, they first created the basis, the foundation of religious sciences, and then the next step was the development of the philosophical sciences, so philosophy, logic, and all of that, and then also the development of the physical sciences, so physics, astronomy, mathematics, and so on. So that's how it was.
Very, very interesting. It's interesting you say that, like science is considered like the yardstick for truth, even though it's always moving, it's always changing and stuff. So I know, for example, things from my own childhood that I grew up with and I believe to be true have now changed. So even as simple as the planets, there were 9 planets when I was growing up, but now all of a sudden Pluto is not a planet. So okay, so so how can this thing that is ever evolving, ever changing, be this this thing that we always
Absolute.
refer to as the answer to all things? And this is
Exactly.
the thing. Even obviously in the start of Surah Kaf, there's the what's the opening line? We sent down the
Yes.
book that contains within it no crookedness. So
Exactly.
what that just that line itself tells you that means what is that like the Quran itself got no crookedness in it, meaning it's completely straight. And what when something's completely straight, that means it can be used as a yardstick for truth
Yardstick for
because
everything.
by
Yes.
by deduction that means that this is the only thing that you have that is it contains no crookedness. Everything else might have something and that cannot be relied on as such. So yeah, no, I completely understand. So one of the things that I came across, I don't know, one thing that I was inspired by, sorry, was the fact that I'm very a massive believer in things like purpose, right? Like ultimately, when this is sadly what we've lost a lot of today. That we kind of going to school, we're going studying, and we're being taught in a certain way. We come out, we're a bit demoralized. We don't really know our purpose or our place in the world. But what I note from people back then is that ultimately they know that their purpose was to worship their Lord, and that doesn't mean just on the prayer mat, doing giving charity and fasting and things like that. That was also through their work, and also because they desired so much to get to know their Lord. How they're going to get to know
Yes.
the Lord? By studying His creation, and this is the kind of spirit. You talk about the scientific spirit. Ultimately, science is about getting to know more and testing and iterating and testing. That ultimately, that's that spirit of innovation and curiosity and discovery that led them on to we want to know our Lord better, and what better way of doing that through let's look at the skies, and let's look at the stars, and let's look at the animals and this around us and stuff. So
Exactly.
just with that in mind, then Abu Bilal, like how would you define what Islamic science is, so to speak? If you were to define it, because you talked about definitions earlier, how do you define Islamic science?
Well, in the definition of the term science, in linguistics, we have something we call haqa'iq al-lugha, the realities of words, of language. And our scholars, linguistic scholars, they've got many different classifications of where a word is applicable. So there's haqiqa wad'iyya, there's haqiqa urfiyya, there is haqiqa shar'iyya, there is haqiqa majaziyya. Like, so there's literal definitions of what the term denotes, what it really means, its initial application and usage. And then there is urfiyya, which is more cultural, conventional use, which changes over time. This is where we get slang from as well. Then there is Sharia, which is the legal use of the term, and then there is Majazia, which is the metaphoric use of the term. So science is something that has got its root definition, its original meaning, its true meaning, if we would rather use that. But it also has its conventional meaning, and unfortunately, what's being utilized is a conventional meaning of it. Now, the English language, like I said, is not an inflectious language. So a word in the English language doesn't stand on its own anymore. It used to be in the older sense that if you say the word, the meaning could be understood immediately. But now you literally have to support that word in what we call in English helping words.
Hmm.
So, and then there are helping words that you have to speak out, and then there are also implied helping words. So the implied word here used to help the definition of science is actually material. Science used in the modern sense, conventionally, is material science. But in the traditional sense, even from Greek origins, science was never used only in the material sense. If you look at the scholastic translations between Greek and Arabic, both of which are scholastic languages, English is not a scholastic language. Latin is a scholastic language from where English brings out most of its roots. Between Greek and Arabic, the term, or actually the term science is Latin. In Greek, the translation is logos,
Mm.
which is where we get all the logy from, right? So
Yeah.
physiology,
Biology. Yeah.
psychology, biology, right? It's the study of. And that's what science really means in its root. It is the study of.
Mm.
So when you have physicality, the science of physicality is now called physics. And then the science of life or organisms is now called biology. So it's the science of, meaning it's a knowledge of, right? And that's what is now defined as ilm in the Arabic. So sciences in the Arabic are ulum in the plural sense. So when you look at Imam al-Ghazali's Ihya al-Ulumuddin, it is the sciences of the revival of the religion or the revival of the Islamic sciences.
Very good.
Now, ulum in this case, the way it is defined by the Arab scholars from the very beginning is that if there was something that could be studied, that could be understood, that could be determined, whose universals and particulars could be established, then it can be a science by itself. And insofar as the expanse of their knowledge was concerned, that included anything and everything in the alameen, in the worlds, the material and immaterial, the seen and the unseen, the physics and the metaphysics. It was all a matter of how you would study it that would determine if you will be able to study it. So even the immaterial theoretically can be studied. It's all a matter of how you would study it. And this is where the spirituality aspect comes in, because again, it goes back to the definition of terms. In the conventional use of the term spirituality, modern, when you use the term, the first image painted is Sufism or Sufi, or maybe not into that extreme. The first image painted is just dhikr, right? So when you say that I'm a spiritual person, an individual might be saying it in the sense that he does a lot of dhikr. But that's just one component of it. Spirituality in this case is you essentially. You are a spiritual being. Your body is a material being, but you are an essence that is occupying this body in the material world. So you are a spiritual being. Human beings are spiritual by creation. So the spirituality aspect is not just a form of worship in the sense that fulfilling the religious rites of spirituality, but it's also a science by itself that studies the spiritual elements of the worlds. Because when you look at the Quran always uses cosmology in a phrase that is sab'a samawat wal ard. It's not just ard. Ard also means, ard can mean the planet, ard can mean land. It can also be matter or material, right? So ard, by definition, Islamic cosmology is more of the material universe, the material world. And then there are 7 other planes which are immaterial, they're spiritual. So the spiritual sciences here are more towards studying those elements. What comprises those worlds? How do they function? What are the different elements there? It's not really a matter of going or traveling through space or looking through a telescope. It's more of insight, intuition, intelligence, the inward sciences, or what you could call, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is what's interesting here is that this is okay. This is a bit I think I'm very vocal about, because I think this is another trait of the world that we live in, or the education, is that we focus so much on data, on logic, and that's the be all and end all, right? But epistemology, even throughout history, has not always been like that. We have, as you mentioned, there were people did recognize the power of insight and intuition, and the gut instinct and all that stuff. And this is where ideas were formed, inspiration was gathered, and that whole internal type of knowledge. So I think there's absolutely an importance of aligning these two worlds together. And obviously that's what Surah Al-Kahf, right? That's the story of Musa and Khidr alayhi
If I
salam.
turn on that particular note, when you look at
Sure.
sciences itself, the Quran never tells you to look at creation as what it is. So, in logic, we say that in logic there's quiddity. The first thing that a human being does is always asks, "What is it?" And then there is abstraction that takes place in which you can understand what the object is. So, whether that object is a planet or a star or a galaxy, the Quran tells you that that's really irrelevant insofar as understanding what creation is. Like once you've determined that there's a planet or there's a star or there's a particle or a molecule or a cell or whatever it is, it's really irrelevant. What the Quran does is it tries to push you more towards understanding how Allah created it, and that's going into the second hierarchy of human perception, which is called tasdeeq. And tasdeeq is basically understanding how the process is. So the Quran, Allah is always asking the question like, "Alam tara ila rabbika kayfa madda dhilla?" You know, do you not see how Allah has extended the shadow? Or he will say, "Alam yarau kayfa yubdi'u Allahu al-khalqa thumma yu'iduhu." Do they not see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala originates creation and then repeats it? Right? And the Quran is always asking this in terms of, do you not see how he did it? Because it's not really the thing itself that's of magnificence. That's the end product. But the process is what he really wants you to understand. Even insofar as the spiritual realms are concerned, Alam tara kayfa khalaqa Allahu sab'a samawatin tibaqa. Right? Do you not see how Allah created the 7 heavens in layers? Tibaqa. And this is an astounding thing in the modern sense that they will look at science. By the way, as much as anyone would want to argue, this is a definite fact. If they argue it, they're really on the wrong platform. Science will only tell you what an object is and might be able to give you a little bit about how that object comes about. But science will never be able to explain to you why that object exists. And I'm talking about modern science, not the traditional sciences.
Sure.
They will never be able to tell you why certain things are the way they are. You know, a doctor will tell you what the disease is or will tell you what the medicine is. Might even tell you how it functions insofar as the causal effectual relationship is concerned, taking the pill down and then the digestion and spreading through the body. But it can never explain to you why that particular medicine actually works. Right? This is one of it's a test. If you really want to know a good doctor, you can ask them, why does aspirin work? And if they can really shake, if they can give you an explanation,
It's a good acid test,
actually is a spiritual individual because he understands why medicine works for the human body. And it's astounding because modern science and modern culture itself tends to look at science as a very institutionalized academic discipline that's purely subjective, and you can only get it from their approved systems of understanding science. Whereas Islam is phenomenal. I mean, the Islamic civilization is the only civilization that ever produced highly literate Bedouins. Like you could have Bedouins in a tent in the desert who are studying Aristotelian logic.
Yeah.
And Platonic philosophy and Socratic argumentations, and it's simply astounding. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf mentions something about his teacher Murabit al-Hajj when he was in Mauritania, and he witnessed Murabit al-Hajj take a handful of sand and just blow it, and he was telling the other student that if the veil was lifted from your eyes, you would see the world like this. And that's astounding in itself, because what he's actually describing there is what we call in quantum physics the field theory. That's literally what he was explaining. Now, he may not be using those exact terms, but that's the concept he was bringing about. So the human being doesn't need to be institutionalized in the modern system of learning and understanding the world that Allah has created how he created it and why he created it, right?
Yeah. Amazing.
But
Yeah.
he has to learn it regardless, which is something else altogether.
Yeah. So just one thing that came to mind as you were talking, like as you said, the power of the Quran is that it has such rich, deep concepts. Like I said, that people in Bedouin who have, let's say, the modern world would have, they'd say, oh, they have no right to have understanding of these kind of concepts.
Oh, they would call it primitive and tribal.
Yeah, exactly. But I read a really interesting stat the other day, which was people who, there was a study done, people who have been to university, like top universities, and who received first class honors, they were the highest in the field. They questioned them on their studies 2 years after they left. Do you know what their retention level was of the sciences or the stuff that they studied? Both of you guess.
I don't think so.
I don't think it was that.
Personal experience.
Psychologically, the maximum you can retain in the moment is, I think, a 20-minute lapse.
Yeah.
Or
Basically, the percentage that they basically as a percentage, they said that 6%. Only 6%. So if you think about how much people spend on their university, let's say they might spend £50,000 on their, so 6% of that, even that they've only retained like £3,000 worth of knowledge or four. You know what I mean? That's how ridiculous. But yet these are the masters of industry. These are the people that we kind of look towards today. That they're gonna make the decisions and be the next pioneers and stuff. So, I mean, Sabreen, I just want to kind of bring you back in because, like, how do you advise someone? Let's say someone did want to study. If someone did want to like look into this a bit more, where do they go? What do they do? How do they use the Quran in a way to study this a bit more deeper? And again, what will it allow them to do?
So this thing that we were discussing right now about education, this is exactly what's wrong. I mean, the fact that you can just retain 6% of what you've studied for, let's say, 4 years, 3 years, 5 years of your college, is actually a manifest proof that our education system is inherently flawed. There's something seriously wrong with it. And this is not how education was done. I remember reading something about, about the same thing about education in Islam, in the Islamic civilization. The miracle of the Islamic civilization was that it turned common people, like we just said, Bedouins, into scholars. And every common folk, which are just consumers, even today, they're just, out there just consuming, those into scholars, which you don't find in earlier civilizations. The learned were only a small group, a very small fringe. You go to the Indian civilization, they were the Brahmins. You go to the Greek civilization, they were very small, literate, and from economically developed cultures and circles in society. But that's the miracle of Islam, is that what it did. Part of the reason, because you asked, how can we have that again, that attitude? Firstly, is an understanding of the history. Let's go back and understand, because many people don't even know that this exists. I think most people don't know that this exists. Let me give you a quote from Dr. Osman Bakr that actually encapsulates all of what we've discussed today. So he says, in Islam, the religious consciousness of Tawheed is the source of the scientific spirit in all domains of knowledge. Consequently, the Islamic intellectual tradition does not entertain the idea of the natural sciences alone as being scientific or as being more scientific than other sciences. So there isn't this, this is more, this is better, it's scientific than the others, because the same consciousness of Tawheed forms the basis of all learning. So if we can revive that attitude again in Islamic circles, within Muslim circles, where we firstly understand how science was studied in our own civilization. We have, usually I always think about this, we have a lot of great thinkers, especially in the Dawa field, when they talk about, they're debating with atheists and this and that. So the question is, does science undermine religion? And usually the response that is given is that no, it doesn't. And the response is philosophical in nature, because then they deconstruct it by saying that this is scientism. So if you're claiming that science undermines religion, that is in itself a philosophy, it's an assumption, and it's a self-defeating argument. So that's a philosophical argument that they're giving. But in my opinion, that can be coupled with another response that you can give, which is a historical response, that we can show you practically that there was a civilization that was 800 years or more of, that contained the best scientific tradition, which actually led to the development of science in Europe. And it was very much rooted in spirituality. Now, let me give you an example. Let me tell you a story. I love this, character from the Islamic Golden Age. So he is called the father of chemistry. Okay, so because he actually took the pseudoscience alchemy and turned it into chemistry by basing it on experimentation and observation, which are indispensable to today's science. So he's the father of chemistry. He also is credited with the invention of the idea of a laboratory. He talks about a laboratory, and before him, we can't find references to a laboratory. So he's the father of, lab science as well. So, but then there's another side to his personality, and I'm going to tell you who I'm talking about. So the other side of his personality is that he's thorough with Islamic theology. He is thorough with the Quranic principles, the Quranic worldview, and he is a mystic, of the first few people to be called Sufi. So this is Jabir bin Hayyan. So remember, being a father of chemistry, and then also being a mystic, thorough with Islamic theology, Quran. So how did he balance it? I think we can get that from one of his quotes, where he says that a scientist must purify their self, so have tazkiyah of the nafs before they start with chemical experimentation. Very different from how we view chemistry now. And another side of his character is that he was the disciple of the Prophet ﷺ's great grandson, Imam Jafar as-Sadiq. So we see, this is very interesting that we see the scientific tradition actually in the very early stages actually being connected to the family of the Prophet ﷺ through this man. Yeah. Now, one of his amazing ideas that I find, it's a fascinating idea, he calls it the theory of taqween. What is that? He says that human beings with advances in their knowledge and their understanding of the laws of nature and the balance that there is in this world. Now, the balance, again, if you remember, the Quran talks about the balance in the universe, the mizan. So he bases that as his philosophy, his basic philosophy. So he says when human beings have enough understanding of the laws of nature and the balance that is in nature, what they can do is they can actually start creating intelligent life in the environment of a laboratory. So you could say he was actually anticipating artificial intelligence or even synthetic biology, cloning, etc. So from him, why I like this particular figure, because this man is actually talking about the scientific method at least centuries before Ibn al-Haytham, and a lot of centuries before the West could talk about the scientific method. Yeah. So he represents how the Islamic scientific tradition is. So if anybody would ask me, okay, define the Islamic scientific tradition that you talk about, how do you say that it was rooted in spirituality or the Quran? I would describe to them Jabir bin Hayyan's work, and then also the three features that I find in his scientific career is that we can see it through his work that Islamic science had all of these three features, which are that it was rigorously scientific. It was truly scientific. What does it mean to be scientific? Your emphasis on observation, experimentation, and classification all of that, all of those principles. It was way advanced, way ahead of its time. So, I mean, here is a man who's talking about 1,000 years back. He's talking about the feasibility of creating artificial intelligent life in a laboratory. I mean, talk about that. And it was all of these, keeping these things in mind, it was strongly rooted in the Quran and the Quranic worldview. This is Islamic science for you. And this is what we need to revive, because there is no other option. Either we have to integrate ourselves with a completely godless worldview, or we need to revive this to safeguard our own worldview and our tradition.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like, you know, when you describe it like that, it makes it think this is not a nice to do. This is a must. If we can't even, yeah, this is a must. Yeah, exactly. I was thinking with my friend once, and we were just discussing like the Quran and stuff in general. And one quote that he was saying, he said, "Oh, you know, when the Quran was in the hand of the few, so in the early days, you know, they conquered the masses, right, because of the advances and the approach, etc. Now the Quran is in the hand of them, in the hands of the masses, but we've been conquered by the few." Right? Does that make sense? So, yeah, but then it makes you think, okay, how do we get to that stage? What's the difference? And I think it's rooted exactly in what you guys have both been saying, that
it's the approach. I mean,
the approach to the Quran. It's the approach to the Quran. Like how powerful the Quran is. Like we've taken the Quran out of our everyday life and out of our everyday work, etc. It's now a book of spirituality. It's now, oh yeah, when we want to connect with Allah, we'll do it. But our day-to-day work, yeah, we don't need the Quran. That's how we live in the world. Is it any coincidence why we're, you know, in the doldrums and, you know, we've got all these challenges and stuff? So I think, well, Bilaal, just bringing you back in, like, what would you say about you know this chronic approach? Any advice for anyone on how to start with the process? And like, I mean, actually, before we go into that, Sister Safiyyah was talking about Jabir bin Hayyan. I mean, do you have any figure from history that you're particularly inspired by, or that we should really look into?
Well, for me, it's only one. I am a fan of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali.
Okay. Yeah. So okay, tell me more, because obviously he's a very misunderstood figure, especially when it comes to science and scientists, and, you know, people think, oh, they quote him when they think, oh, he destroyed Islamic science and stuff. So do you want to tell me a little bit more about that and your thoughts around that?
Well, the one thing is, first of all, an internal argument within the Islamic Ummah concerning Ghazali, and then the other one is an external argument from Orientalists and secular science. The internal argument is people calling him a Sufi and calling him a misguided individual, and he went off the track. And without mentioning who these sects are and where they come from, I mean, they know themselves and we know who they are. But he wasn't. Imam al-Ghazali was never a Sufi insofar as the definition or modern definition of the term Sufi. Actually, Imam al-Ghazali was an Usuli scholar first. He was really a master of the different schools of thought, and he built his spirituality from there. That's one concept about Imam al-Ghazali, is that he partitions two streams of knowledge. One he calls ilm al-mu'amala and the other ilm al-mukashafa. Amala, from amal, meaning demonstrative, actionable knowledges or actionable sciences, and that he defines as the physical sciences as well, including the religious physical sciences. So the salah, the sawm, the science of the fiqh, the language, and all that stuff. Then ilm al-mukashafa, he from the word kashf, he defines as revealed knowledge, which is now coming in from the spiritual realms. And this is something that can be verified by the Quran itself. If you look at Surah Kahf and examine Musa and Al-Khidr and the union of two, one who is grounded in worldly knowledges, which was Nabi Musa alayhi salam, and then the other who is Al-Khidr and is grounded in spiritual knowledges, and there is a convergence of two, which the Quran defines as Majma'ul Bahrain, the union or the junction.
But the two seas meet, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is what Ghazali was showing, that when it comes to worldly knowledges, there is a certain limit to worldly knowledges. Beyond that limit, you can go way off track. And this is something we're witnessing in our modern age. Sister Safiyyah spoke about the artificial intelligence and all these other elements. That we've got also genetic engineering, we've got synthetic life, and yes, the science is there because you can manipulate physicality in any which way you want within the laws of physicality and build something else. That doesn't mean you should do it, right? It doesn't mean you go into the sun, because then it becomes kufr, it becomes sihr, it becomes a whole bunch of other things. And we can see these manifestations taking place now. That's now going more into the eschatological elements. Imam al-Ghazali said that there is a limit to how much those knowledges should be pursued. After that, stop your focus on those elements and now start cultivating your akhirah. Really build on spiritual, understand what your spiritual essence is, what your existential purpose is, and cultivate your world accordingly, because this life is temporary. This world itself is temporary. I mean, even science has to affirm that at one point, to say that this physical universe will definitely be destroyed. Whether it's destroyed in a zero-sum universe or it is destroyed in maximum entropy, it doesn't matter. It will be destroyed. It will end, right? So his focus was more look towards the spiritual sides. And this was astounding because it actually took Muslims towards that direction. So Ghazali did not bring about the decline of science in the modern use of the term science by their reasoning that, oh, if Ghazali was not there, we could have had computers 800 years ago, right? That's an irrelevant matter whether you had computers now. It doesn't change reality. But he didn't. He gave Muslims a renewed purpose, and that's why I really admire him. And when you look at his other books, his Maqasid al-Falasif, his Tahaffut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of philosophers. He's also pointing towards them as well and saying, listen, there's only so far as how much your thinking can deduce your knowledge. At that point, you need to recognize your boundaries and limits and then turn to what Allah is telling you. So turn back to the Quran and verify your thoughts and your theories and your everything else. And in that regard, Ghazali is the I would say is the doorway. When you asked about how one would approach studying sciences from the Quran, you cannot just dive straight into the Quran. You can't do it. One would confuse themselves because the Quran doesn't speak linearly to people. Modern science is a linear language. One thing leads to another. It's causal effect mostly. Even the perception of time in the modern sciences, with the use of the English language, time itself is perceived linearly. Right? We write left to right. We deduce time, a count of time, a measure of time from the clock in a left to right progression, which is clockwise. A lot of things that we do physically is a linear progression based on how we think, which is primarily in the English language. When you look at the Arabic language, it breaks all manner of linearity. It's got the quantitative elements, which are the numbers that come from one direction, which is left to right, but then it's got the qualitative elements, which is the actual language that comes from right to left. And you know, it sort of distorts you. If you're going to look at the Quran as a quantitative book, you'll be thrown off. Right? So to reach to the Quran itself recognizes, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He raises in rank whom He calls ulul albab. In the interpretive sense of the Quran, the mutashabih, which is largely the essence of where the Quranic interpretations of physical sciences and metaphysical sciences lie, the Quran says that only the ulul albab can actually be able to grasp the true interpretive elements of the Quran. And the albab, the doorway, now this is the final doorway, it has to go back to it. It's a series of doorways that an individual has to go through. So the student opens the doorway to himself first, because you have to be honest with yourself exactly which path do you want to take. Open the doorway to your inner intellect and your insight. And then the teacher will open the doorway to the scholar. And the scholar will open the doorway to the tabi'in or the awliya. The awliya will open the doorway to the sahaba, who will then open the doorway to the prophet. And he will open the doorway to the Quran. And the first doorway that will be opened is the first ayah of the Quran, which is the Fath, the opening, or Surah Fatiha. The first ayah of that is Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Praise unto Allah, the Lord of the worlds. And right there, in the first instance, the first commandment is that understand your reality, understand the world that you live in. If you want to give Allah His deserved praise, because when you give praise, you give praise to one who is deserving praise. You don't just throw praise out, otherwise it's meaningless.
Yeah.
But for you to recognize how much praise does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deserve, for you to really fully realize it so that you can give Him His due, you have to understand what are His achievements, to use a loose term. And His achievement is that He created everything, the Rabbul Alameen. And for you to understand Him as the Rabb, you have to understand the Alameen, which are the worlds. And that's where the term ilm is also derived from, because knowledge is knowing the worlds. Right? And the Alameen is all encompassing. It's not one world. It's not one universe. It's more than that. It's not even multiverses or multiple universes. It's layered one on top of the other. They are different stratas. Right? And to understand Alameen, you have to also have a perception of Alameen. How do you define what Alameen is? What's your perception of that reality? Because if your eyesight is closed here, in your sadr, in your intellect, if that eyesight is closed, then you're only going to see the physicality. You will not see the spiritual.
Yeah, of course. And this is what I mean. You talked a lot about sort of the linear and that's how kind of science is. It's also how kind of education is as well. And this is probably a conversation for another day, because again, one of the things that of people of the past is that they weren't linear. They were multifaceted. They were, you might call them polymaths, you might call them generalists or whatever. And that's another thing, like, we really, really believe, is that because when you know, even if you look at the people of today who we admire Elon Musk and Steve Jobs, all these people have got you could call them sort of polymath, because when you have that kind of knowledge of multiple things, you can start connecting the dots. And in the same way, when you can start connecting when you have different knowledge of different things and different subjects, and so in a way, I was always considered a generalist growing up, right? And it was also something I was very self-conscious of. And it's only like in the past, how long, that I realized that, you know what, even though it's something that in society, we have the whole jack of all trades, master of none, etc. I realized that no, actually, I started embracing it. I was like, no, actually, this is a good thing, because this having a knowledge of multiple things and deep knowledge of some things actually helps to elevate you and connect the dots, and allows you to discover things that other people might not see, because it's just so deep but narrow. So
exactly.
So I'm sure that we'll talk about that in another live stream, inshallah. So I'm conscious of time. What I was going to do is that I'm going to open the floor to like sort of questions in the comments. I can't really see any comments that have come up, but in the meantime, Safiyyah, if you want to sort of say your kind of any like final sort of thoughts, any final words, and then I'll say them to you, and then inshallah, in the meantime, if any questions come in, we can answer them, and then we can end it there, inshallah.
Sure. What I would just add to all of what has been said is, again, this this characteristic of the Islamic civilization was that it actually recognized the limits of the intellect. It didn't limit the intellect. It didn't ignore the intellect. It recognized that these are the limits of intellect. Like, for example, we have in the story of Iblis. What we see is essentially he's misusing his intellect. He thinks that that can be used in that realm. That realm is not the realm of intellect. That realm is the realm of the heart. That realm is the realm of obedience. There you put your your intellect, you shut it down, and you listen to what Allah is saying, because there is somebody who knows way, way, way more than you. So the problem with today's world is that you have that same attitude. We're pushing intellect into things that cannot be understood by intellect. That's one issue. So I really want to actually talk about, because one contention that some people have regarding this, we've talked about God and science, Islam and science, and how if they were united, is that somehow as if it would hamper scientific research if you get in God, the God question. We don't want metaphysics in the door. Many modern scientists and philosophers they talk like this. That is why it's important to present the Islamic history as an example that this attitude didn't lead to a regression. Rather, actually, it led to further research in the scientific field. And that's something, because you don't have this thing, this attitude. Usually you'll hear people saying, oh, previous civilizations, because they couldn't explain certain things, they said God did it. So, God of the gaps, that's called. That doesn't work in Islam. That cannot be applied to Islam, because in Islam, the only way to understand God is through his creation. You can never know the essence of God. You can only know him through his creation, his attributes that are manifest in creation. So it has to be studied using the physical world. Now, I mentioned Jabir bin Hayyan, and in him we can see like the limits. What he's actually, when he talks about artificial intelligence, like in his theory of the Queen, he's actually giving you the limits of the intellect. And just imagine, he's saying these are the limits of the intellect. So that's where the limit of the spirit then starts. Imagine the kind of power that we have been invested in then, when you keep that in mind. And it's all in the intention. It's all in the approach. So most of the science, because we had, all of our theme this month was about life sciences. Biology, zoology were discussed in the Islamic scientific tradition. But they didn't lead to the atheism and the skepticism and the philosophical naturalism, which is atheism, in the Muslim world. Why didn't they do that? The answer is simple, because they contextualized it. They put it in the context of the broader metaphysical worldview that they had. No, these spiritual, these natural processes are actually guided. They cannot be just blind, random phenomena. And the same thing with Jabir bin Hayyan, when he was talking about artificial intelligence, or even sort of talking about how you can manipulate reality. He's not doing so with the kind of attitude that we have now. That's why he's so interesting, because he is talking about these things in order to understand God, to understand Allah and how he has created this balance, this mizan. The more you understand the world, the closer you'll get to God. And that is something I would leave you on that note. Please do check my online course out on Jabir bin Hayyan. I've actually, I really wanted to make an online course on him, because that's where you can get access to how the Islamic scientific tradition worked, where you had the best of the both the worlds, and this Majma' al-Bahrain actually being used in scientific research. So do check my online course out. Maybe I'll put a link of that in the description, and it's on the Know website. And I've attached a few sort of documents with it as well that will give us an insight on how spiritual was the scientific tradition, and how scientific also was the spiritual tradition. It wasn't just mere talk of spirituality. It was, experiential knowledge of God, certain knowledge of God, but in a completely different realm. So please do that as well.
So yeah, definitely check out that course on the No website. And I think Safiyyah has put a lot of time and effort into creating that, and I think it really gets across not only all about this amazing figure of our past, but exactly what made him so great and what we can learn to take into modern day. And I think this is an important distinction, isn't it, Sister Safiyyah, that this is not about just understanding history for the sake of it. Oh yeah, we were once great and being proud of that. It's actually about learning what drove them and what were the building blocks, so that we can then take from that and build it into our own lives, and inshallah revive that golden age, inshallah. So Abu Bilal, any kind of final closing thoughts, and then we'll end it there, inshallah.
Actually, I'll just quickly add on what Safiyyah said on two actually elements. One, she mentioned Tawheed from Osman Bakar's description, and then worldview. They're actually two, both one and the same, because when you look at modern secularism, the root definition of secularism is the separation of God or religion from all state affairs. And the moment you separate religion, you separate God as well. But when you look at the Quran and the first opening of the Quran, it actually starts with Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. So if you go back in that regression, knowing the world will help you know the Lord, and that will help you know the One. So the natural impetus of the human being, which is our fitra, our natural disposition, is to see the one in the many, right?
Exactly.
It's to go backwards from the multiplicity to the one. That's the usul of Tawheed, of the deen. And the deen is essentially what defines an individual's view of the world. Now, worldview is a very broad philosophical subject. There are different definitions. There are different theories. Some will bring it out from a linguistic point of view. Some will bring it out from a cultural point of view. The most dominant, in my view, and even among secular philosophers such as Noam Chomsky, for example, who's not really is more of a linguist. But we hold that a worldview is defined by the language used, because language influences thought, and then thought manifests into cultivation of the world. So the Islamic worldview is something that is unique in its own standpoint comparative to a secular worldview. And since I already explained what a reality is by definition, you can see that Islam holds a different worldview of reality as something that is existentially truth. But it does not negate factual reality either. And it has its own, and Arabic is a very specific language. It's got incredible specificity. So there is a term for factual reality, which is what the worldly sciences are compiled of. In the worldview of the Muslim, ultimately his impetus is to understand his existential purpose. And in philosophy also, it's basically called the problem of identity and the problem of destiny. The human being, ultimately, when he's alone and he's lost in his own thoughts and he comes face to face with himself, will always try to figure out, who am I and what is my destiny? And that is guided by an individual's worldview, because Islam tells you that deen, from the root of dana, is a debt. You have to pay back a certain debt. And the method of payment is always dictated by the creditor. So he is the one who dictates and tells you the stipulations of how you're going to pay back this debt. And the reason you're paying back a debt is because he's given you something that you did not have. And that is your existence. He's given you an existence. And your existence is governed by the time that you have been allocated with. So his stipulation is basically, give me your time and you will pay back your debt. So submission to him is essentially what Islam defines And the definition of Islam is to submit to the will of Allah by giving him your time, which is your most precious commodity. But he doesn't leave it as such. He also gives you something in exchange. And he says, if you give me your time, I will give you knowledge. I will give you more and lift up more and more of the veil concerning myself.
Wow.
So that, but you have to follow the rules. You have to follow the stipulations. You can't define your own set of rules and tell the bank that I'll pay my mortgage based on what I think is right, and when I feel like paying it back. It doesn't work like that. So you have to follow his guideline and his Sharia and his structure ordained. So that ultimately,
great analogy, yeah. Well,
right.
Wow.
And he's doing that because he is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Right. There's no other definition for him insofar as the human being is concerned. This whole ideology of, a wrathful God or a powerful God, even the very definition of the term mercy is not insofar as punishment. Be merciful on me and take the punishment away. It's more in terms of kindness, and he's doing that as a favor, as a ni'mah. Right, which is why he also said that on this day, the last of revelation that was revealed was, on this day I have fulfilled for you your deen, and I have bestowed upon you my ni'mah. It's a favor from Allah that He's actually given you a solution to answering that existential problem that you have. Who am I, and what is my destiny? So that ultimately you recognize that there will be a destiny, and that's called Yawmuddin. And Yawmuddin, therefore, is the day when all debts are due. So Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmuddin. That's when He is the Lord, or the King, the owner, the possessor of the day of reckoning, when all debts are due. If that is your worldview, then ultimately you will cultivate your present reality in accordance to that. Exactly. But if the worldview is to take away the deen and ultimately take away God, then essentially your worldview will be based on everything else that you can see. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does say it, that I am what my servant thinks of me. Right? So if you don't think of him as anything, then he will not be anything to you. And then he also says that the offspring of Adam abuse ad-dahr. Ad-dahr is eternity, and abuses ad-dahr. And he says, Ana ad-dahr, I am eternity. And so if you have no consideration of your time, if you don't really understand how much of what the value of your time in existence is, then time will also not give you any consideration at all. So ultimately, on the day of reckoning, you have got nothing to show. And that's the ultimate reality, whether they choose to accept it or not. The process of sciences, between science and spirituality, is not a dichotomy. It's been made to be a dichotomy, but it has never been as such, even among the Greeks, for that matter. People like Socrates were actually arguing out against the materialists at that time. And these were individuals who grounded themselves in sciences. Someone like Plato, in philosophy, it's known as Plato's problem, in which they try to how do people actually come to learn? How do you gain knowledge? And Plato is someone who said that this is not something we can answer. It's something that comes in from our past life, and that in itself, even though the subjective elements are arguable, but that shows you that they were thinking on a spiritual scale. And that's essentially what it is. To know the world has its limitation, but it should be the platform on which it will then take you onward, because the human being's existence is a continuum. It's not standstill, and it's not definite, and it's not in a bubble that we have been led to believe. So, alhamdulillah, I hope you get something from that.
Yeah, inshallah. I mean, may Allah allow us all to kind of fulfill our debts and to know more of Him, inshallah. I mean, so Jazakallah khair, Abu Bilaal and Safiyyah, and Jazakallah khair to everyone for kind of watching us live. Inshallah, this is going to be as I said, this is the first of a monthly live stream that we're going to be doing, inshallah. We'll probably announce the next topic in a few weeks, and then make sure that you tune in for the next one. So with that, I say Assalamu alaikum, and inshallah we'll see you next time.
Inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.